Hello, this is Captain Yardbird. I came across a statistic recently that got my gears churning. SeekingArrangement.com puts my city of Austin, Texas, as having the highest concentration of sugar daddies of any U.S. city. Something under 2.5% of the city's men are active sugar daddies. And as we know, the nuclear family of the 50s has been dying for quite some time, and I want to put forth the argument that the soft harem will overtake it in the coming decades. For this video, I want to preface this argument by looking at one particular article I stumbled on in researching this topic from The Atlantic in November of 2011. The author's very clearly a feminist, though she doesn't appear to be as narrative-driven as those we've become so accustomed to of late. On the contrary, I find this work to be quite sober, although a bit myopic, in its observations of reality within the context of the West. So I want to work through it with you. I'll skip around quite a bit as I'm chasing my own line of thought here, rather than that of the author's. To start with, her point of view is from being in the midst of the wall. At the time of the article, Kate Bolick, aged 39, makes the following statements. Between the diminishing external pressure to have children and the common misperception that our biology is ours to control, some of us don't deal with the matter in a timely fashion. Do I realize that this further narrows my pool of prospects? Yes. I am fully aware that with each passing year I become less attractive to the men in my peer group, who have plenty of younger, more fertile women to pick from. By blithely deeming biology a non-issue, I'm conveniently removing myself from arguably the most significant decision a woman has to make. But that's only if you regard motherhood as the defining feature of womanhood, and I happen not to. She does periodically make statements throughout this article which I take issue with. However, I am chiefly interested in her observations, not so much her opinions and her interpretations. So I don't plan on spending much time doing the anti-fem bit of rebuking her. I'd next like to share this refreshing excerpt. In 2008, women still earn just 77 cents to the male dollar, but that figure doesn't account for the difference in hours worked, or the fact that women tend to choose lower-paying fields like nursing or education. A 2010 study of single, childless urban workers between the ages of 22 and 30 found that the women actually earned 8% more than the men. Of course, for arguably the internet's most beloved refutation of the mythical wage gap, you should see shoe on head. But moving on now. American women as a whole have never been confronted with such a radically shrinking pool of what are traditionally, and I'm inclined to argue biologically, considered to be marriageable men, those who are better educated and earn more than they do. Over the past half-century, women have steadily gained on and are in some ways surpassing men in education and employment. Women are also more likely than men to go to college. In 2010, 55% of all college graduates ages 25 to 29 were female. Men have been rapidly declining in income, educational attainment, and future employment prospects relative to women. As of 2010, women held 51.4% of all managerial and professional positions, up from 26% in 1980, and men are now more likely than women to hold only a high school diploma. Nearly 3/4 of the 7.5 million jobs lost in the depths of the recession were lost by men, making 2010 the first time in American history that women made up the majority of the workforce. All of this data she presents results in what academics called a crisis in gender, which is defined by a skewed ratio of available men to available women. She brings up a couple of historical examples of such crises, but what makes this one interesting is that the male population is not quantifiably smaller than the female population. Rather, it is lesser in terms of quality. That is, in terms of status, the The median male is of lesser sexual market value than the median female. I think this dynamic is very much a component of the skewed nature of the curves Colttaine presented in his video Gender Attraction Differential, which was recently featured on Teal'c's channel. More about crises of gender. She cites post-Civil War America as well as post-World War II Russia. The Russian example is particularly intriguing as, in order to replenish the population, the state instituted an aggressive policy. Mothers were given generous subsidies, and penalties were brandished for anyone who perpetuated the stigma against conceiving out of wedlock. In 1944, a new law passed, which essentially freed men from responsibility for illegitimate children. I find in the post-war Russian policy a fascinating precedent for a parental surrender law. Not without consequences. Everything has consequences, of course, and she lists them quite critically. Bolick moves on to cite a 1983 book, Too Many Women? The Sex Ratio Question. The authors of this book, a pair of psychologists, developed a certain Guten-Tag's Accord theory holding that members of the gender in shorter supply are less dependent on their partners because they have a greater number of alternative relationships available to them. In societies where men heavily outnumber women, rates of illegitimacy and divorce are low. However, female literacy and labor force participation drop. In contrast, when confronted with a surplus of women, men become unwilling to commit to a monogamous relationship. In societies with too many women, fewer people marry, and those who do marry do so later in life. I would also bet that in the first scenario with too many men, women likely cheat a fair bit for preferential genetic stock. Look at the Economist article Cads and Dads, which I've cited before. She continues, in 1988, a pair of sociologists set out to test the Guten-Tag's Accord theory by analyzing 117 countries. They also found that the dynamics were more pronounced in developed rather than developing countries. I'm very inclined to think that the extremity with which the theory plays out is more due to the relative scarcity of resources. I would point you to CS's video, Calories, Epigenetics, and MGTOW, in which he illustrates that monogamy arises and flourishes in cases where you have both a scarcity of resources and a lack of predators, or other external culling mechanisms. So in post-industrial societies, resources are not sufficiently scarce that our populations have to utilize monogamy to prevent ourselves overpopulating and starving out. I would also argue that when a society has too many young, economically frustrated men, it is terribly destabilizing. I'd like to quote a book called The Irritable Male Syndrome, and I haven't read this one yet, but it is on my to-do list. Jared Diamond published it in 2005. I'm a huge fan of his better-known work Guns, Germs, and Steel, and have tremendous respect for his writing and willingness to court controversy. In The Irritable Male Syndrome, I found this bit, thanks to Google, in which he quotes a futurist by the name of Eddie Weiner. The most destabilizing geopolitical force in the world today is the vast number of young men without jobs and other opportunities. Diamond then points out what we know as hypergamy. As we have seen, underemployment makes it difficult for young men to attract mates, and one of the leading predictors of violence in countries throughout the world is the percentage of young men between the ages of 20 and 29 who are not married. That point is certainly a long-observed correlation in the economic contexts of agrarian and industrial societies, and especially developing nations. Really, though, marriage is an indication that two important factors are true of a society. A, the male population is economically stable enough to pursue family building, and B, the women do not outperform the men. This inverse correlation between marriage and crime really breaks down in the post-industrial economy, likely to the break of factor B. C.S. MGTOW's recent video, Debunked, Marriage Reduces Crime, excellently highlights this breakdown. Bolick also describes what she calls the dating gap. Marriage-minded women are increasingly confronted with either deadbeats or players. For evidence, we have the college campus. Of course, by deadbeat, what I insist she means is any man whose status isn't suitable in comparison to her own. But anyway, last year, a former management consultant named Susan Walsh tried to dig deeper. She applied what economists call the Pareto principle, that is the 80-20 rule, to the college dating market, and concluded that only 20% of the men, those considered to have the highest status, are having 80% of the sex, with only 20% of the women, and those with the greatest sexual willingness. The remaining 80%, male and female, sit out the hookup dance altogether. Surprisingly, I don't find it surprising at all personally, a 2007 study commissioned by the Justice Department suggested that male virgins outnumber female virgins on campus. As Walsh puts it, most of the leftover men are have-nots in terms of access to sex, and most of the women in general are have-nots in terms of access to male attention that leads to commitment. One of Walsh's pet observations pertains to what she calls the soft harem, where high-status men maintain an official girlfriend as well as a rotating roster of neo-concubines. I think that, as said before, the soft harem will become more common than marriage in the coming couple decades, as women will continue to outperform men economically and find the majority of their male peers unsuitable for reproduction. Now let's see what Bolick has to say about the nuclear family as an historical anomaly whose time is up. The Census Bureau has reported that in 2010, the proportion of married households in America dropped to a record low of 48%. 58% of the adult population is single, up from 33% in 1950, a trend likely to continue. In 2010, nearly twice as many single women bought homes as did single men. Our cultural fixation on the couple is actually a relatively recent development, though pair bonding has been a thing for some 3.5 million years, according to a biological anthropologist, Helen Fisher. The hunter-gatherers evolved in egalitarian groups with men and women sharing labor equally. Children were raised by the village, I would argue. Divorce was common. Fisher sees the contemporary trend for marriage between equals as us moving forward into deep history. Now, from what I gather, Bolick and her sources don't recognize the level of conflict inherent to those ancient times. Here I would point you to my first video on human nature and tribal leadership, and more specifically the Economist article I cited there, Noble or Savage. Bolick. It wasn't until we moved to farms and became an agrarian economy centered on property that the married couple became the central unit of production. By the Middle Ages, the combination of the couple's economic interdependence and the Church's success in limiting divorce had created the tradition of getting married to one person and, until death do us part. It became economic necessity for the marriage to remain intact. For a more complete picture as to the transition to agricultural civilization, I suggest Stardusk's video on Neolithic hypergamy. But Bolick continues, until the mid-1800s, the word love used to describe neighborly and familial feelings more often than to describe those felt toward a mate, and same-sex friendships were conducted with what we now would consider a romantic intensity. When honeymoons first started, the newlyweds brought their friends and family along for the fun. And she points out, fairly strongly, it wasn't until very recently that us humans began to put all of our emotional needs on one person, and it's been found that this simply doesn't work. In coming videos, I plan to tackle various aspects of this conundrum. I hope you found my preface intriguing. don't bother me with the details. Fuck you and fuck your facts. I'm Captain Yardbird, bidding you good night.